I want to tell you about a bottle of wine I almost opened alone at 6 in the morning. It was a 1987 DeLuca Reserve, the last one we had. Rosa and I had been saving it for 37 years, keeping it in the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator, behind the everyday glasses and the chipped coffee mugs, waiting for my granddaughter's wedding or some other moment large enough to deserve it. The morning I found out what my own son had agreed to, I took it down, set it on the kitchen table, and poured one glass. I didn't drink it. I just sat there looking at it in the early light, thinking about my father. My father came to this country from a small village outside Palermo, with $40 and a willingness to work until his hands gave out. He planted the first vines on this property in 1974 with a hand auger he borrowed from a neighbor and never returned because the neighbor moved back to Fresno before he could. He spoke enough English to buy what he needed and argue when he had to, and he built something from soil that everyone else in the valley had written off as too rocky, too dry, too far from the money. He called the first bottle Frank, after me. I was 9 years old. He held it up in the afternoon light and said, in the particular mix of Sicilian and English he used his whole life, that this was what it meant to make something from nothing. Not the wine, the waiting. My name is Frank DeLuca. I am 66 years old. I have been farming this land in California's Central Valley for 40 years, the last 22 of them as sole owner, after my father passed and left me everything, including the debt on the East Field, and a handwritten note that said only, "Don't sell it, Frank. Don't ever sell it." I haven't, not yet, not ever, if I have anything to say about it. The morning this story begins, it was October, and the harvest had just finished. The last of the Zinfandel had come in clean, and the crews had gone home, and the vineyard had that particular stillness that only comes after the work is done. I went out before sunrise, the way I always do, walked the rows in the dark while the fog sat low on the ground. And when I got to the northwest block, the oldest part of the property, the section my father planted himself, I did what I have done every morning for 40 years. I knelt down and pressed my palm flat against the soil. My father taught me that. He said the ground tells you things words can't. He said if you've been paying attention long enough, you can feel when something's wrong before you can name it. I'd always thought he meant the soil itself, moisture content, temperature, the kind of subtle feedback that a farmer learns to read like a language. But that morning, with my hand flat on the cold October ground and the fog still heavy above me, I understood he might have meant something else entirely. Something was wrong. I couldn't have told you what. I just knew it. The way you know weather before the clouds arrive. I went back to the house. Rosa was already in the kitchen. She had the coffee going and was standing at the counter looking out the window at the vineyard the way she does when she's thinking about something she hasn't said yet. 40 years of marriage teaches you to read a person without asking. I poured a cup and sat down at the table, and we were quiet together for a while, which is its own kind of conversation. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something moved across her face. A small thing. The kind of thing you'd miss if you didn't know where to look. She answered, listened for a moment, said yes, of course, we'll be here, and hung up. She placed the phone face down on the counter between us. Vincent and Claire were coming for Thanksgiving, she said. They had something important to discuss. I looked at my coffee. Vincent is our younger son, 38 years old, lives in San Francisco with his wife of 2 years, works in something involving financial software that I have never entirely understood. He is a good man. He is also a man who phones his mother when he needs to arrange something, and his father when something has already gone wrong. And this call had gone to Rosa. I'd heard that phrase before. Something important to discuss. In 40 years of farming, I'd heard bankers say it, and lawyers say it, and neighbors say it before they ask to buy your water rights. It was never just a conversation. It was always a preamble. Rosa picked up her mug and looked out the window again. I had seen that look on Rosa's face exactly twice before in 40 years. Once when her mother died in the night without warning. Once when Anthony came home from his first year of college and sat down at this same table and told us he was dropping out to work the farm instead. Which was either the best or worst news, depending on which year you asked me. Both times, she had been right to worry. They arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, pulling up the gravel drive in a silver rental car that was too clean for the valley dust. Claire got out first. I was on the porch with my coffee when she stepped out and looked at the vineyard the way a person looks at real estate. Not with admiration, exactly. With calculation. She took in the rows, the equipment barn, the old stone cellar my father built in '79. And she did it quickly, the way someone does when they've already seen photographs and are now confirming measurements. Vincent came around from the driver's side, smiling the smile he uses when he wants everyone to be comfortable. It's a good smile. He's had it since he was 12. I used to think it meant he was happy. Now I know it means he's managing something. I shook his hand and held it a moment longer than usual. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. Rosa came out and hugged them both, and we went inside. Dinner that night was the way family dinners are when something is happening underneath. The food was good because Rosa's food is always good. The conversation stayed on safe ground. The harvest, San Francisco traffic, a cousin's new baby in Sacramento. Claire complimented the wine twice, which is once more than necessary. Anthony and his wife Maria sat at the far end of the table. Anthony was quiet in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. His usual quiet is the quiet of a man who's been outdoors all day and doesn't have much left for talking. This was something else. He kept his eyes on his plate and reached for the bread twice without eating it. I noticed. I didn't say anything. It was Claire who brought up the trust. She did it the way you drop something in water to see if it floats. Casual, almost offhand, somewhere between the pasta and the salad. She was asking about the property boundaries, she said, just out of curiosity. And then, just as casually, she asked whether the farm was still under the original family trust structure. I said yes. One word. I watched her file it away. Vincent said something about the wine then, redirecting, and the conversation moved on. But I'd seen what I needed to see. Claire wasn't making conversation. She was collecting information. And she was good enough at it that if I hadn't been paying attention, I would have missed it entirely. Anthony looked up from his plate right at that moment and caught my eye. Then he looked away. Too fast. After dinner, Rosa and Maria cleared the table, and Claire offered to help in a way that made clear she had no intention of helping. Vincent followed me out to the porch. The night was cold and clear, the kind of October night in the valley where you can see every star and the frost is already forming on the equipment. We stood there a minute without talking, looking at the rows. Dad, Vincent said, Claire has some ideas that could really help the farm. I looked at my son. He was 38 years old, dressed in clothes that cost more than my first truck, standing on the land where he grew up picking Zinfandel in the August heat for $5 an hour, because I believed in teaching him what things were worth. I asked him what kind of ideas. Financial restructuring, he said. Tax optimization. A way to protect the assets and modernize the operation. She's been putting together a proposal. I asked him if he'd read it. He said Claire had walked him through it. That's not what I asked. I said. He looked out at the vineyard. The outdoor light from the barn caught the side of his face, the way it had when he was a boy, sitting on this same porch doing homework he didn't want to do. It's a good opportunity. Dad, he said. I finished my coffee. The frost was settling on the nearest row, a faint white edge along the wire where the last leaves were still holding. Vincent, I said, I've been reading weather a long time. I know what it looks like before it arrives. He didn't answer that. He went inside. I stood on the porch alone for another minute, looking at the vineyard my father planted, thinking about the way Claire had asked about the trust structure over pasta like it was nothing, thinking about Anthony's eyes going to his plate a half-second too quickly, thinking about the particular quality of Vincent's smile when he said the words tax optimization, like he was reciting something he'd been coached to say. I didn't know yet exactly what was coming, but I knew it had already started. The folder was on the kitchen table when I came down at 5:30 the next morning. Claire had left it there sometime the night before, placed squarely in the center of the table like a place setting. No note, no explanation, just a manila folder with a small white label on the tab that read, DeLuca Farm Restructuring Proposal. Typed and printed, not handwritten. I poured coffee and sat down and opened it. The document was 31 pages. The first 7 were what you'd expect from something called a tax optimization proposal. Diagrams, projections, language about depreciation schedules and pass-through entities and liability protection. Reasonable-sounding things presented in the kind of formatting that's designed to make you feel like you're reading something professional rather than something you should read carefully. I read carefully. Page 8 had a section heading that said, Operational Authority Structure. Underneath it was a paragraph describing the formation of a new limited liability company called CDV Holdings. The paragraph explained that CDV Holdings would assume operational and financial decision-making authority for all activities associated with the DeLuca Farm property, including but not limited to contracts, sales agreements, and asset management. I read that sentence 3 times. CDV Holdings. C for Claire, D for DeLuca, V for Vincent. Formed without my knowledge. Assigned authority over my farm's operations. Described in a proposal left on my kitchen table without a conversation. I kept reading. The language got more specific further down the page. CDV Holdings would have the authority to enter into agreements on behalf of the farm's operational entity. It would control the farm's business bank accounts within 60 days of signing. It would have the right to negotiate and execute contracts with third parties on behalf of DeLuca Farm operations. On behalf of... That phrase did a lot of work in that document. I set down my coffee and went back to the beginning and read the whole thing again. Slower this time. The way you reread something when you want to make sure you understood it right, and are hoping you didn't. I understood it right. Rosa came downstairs at 6:15. I heard her on the stairs before she appeared in the kitchen doorway, and I didn't look up from the document. She didn't say anything. She poured herself coffee, came to the table, and sat down across from me. She looked at the folder and then at my face, and then she wrapped both hands around her mug and waited. That's the thing about 40 years with the same person. You don't always need to explain what you're reading. Sometimes they can see it from across the table. I turned to the last page. There were 3 signature lines. The first was for Vincent DeLuca, with a title underneath that said, Managing Member CDV Holdings. His signature was already there, in blue ink, in the handwriting I'd watched develop from grade school printing to the loose cursive he uses now. My son had signed this document. He had signed it before bringing it to my house, before sitting at my dinner table, before standing on my porch telling me Claire had some ideas that could really help the farm. He had signed it and said nothing. The second signature line said Frank DeLuca, property owner, blank. The third said Rosa Maria DeLuca, property owner, also blank. I put the document down on the table between us. Rosa looked at the last page. She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Not squeezing, just there, the way you put your hand on something to steady it. Outside the kitchen window, the vineyard was just starting to appear in the early light. The rows emerging from the dark in that slow gray way they do in October when the mist is still sitting on the ground. The vines were bare now, harvest done. They looked the way they always look after the grapes are gone, patient, like they'd been waiting a long time and had no problem waiting longer. I turned back to page 8 and read the CDV Holdings paragraph one more time. Operational and Financial Decision-Making Authority. Vincent's signature in blue ink on the last page. I closed the folder. I left the folder on the table and drove into Modesto. I didn't tell Vincent or Claire where I was going. I left a note for Rosa that said, "Back by noon," and took the old truck, the one I use for the farm. Because I needed to think, and I think better in that truck than anywhere else. Something about the engine noise and the familiar smell of soil and diesel. Joe Caruso has had his office above the hardware store on McHenry Avenue for 35 years. He does land law, water rights, agricultural contracts, the kind of work that keeps Central Valley Farms from disappearing one bad deal at a time. We've been friends since before either of us had gray hair. I've never needed him professionally, which is the best thing you can say about a lawyer friendship. His secretary waved me through without calling ahead. Joe was at his desk with reading glasses on and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been there since yesterday. He took off the glasses when I came in and gestured at the chair across from him. "I need to ask you something hypothetically," I said. He put the glasses on his desk. "That's never a good opening. Frank." "I know," I said. I described the CDV holding structure without showing him the document. The LLC formation, the operational authority language, the managing member designation, the signature already in place from a family member. I kept it general. I said a friend was dealing with a situation. Joe listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in both hands. "This hypothetical friend," he said, "this isn't a tax optimization structure." "I didn't think so," I said. "An LLC with operational and financial decision-making authority over a farm property isn't protecting assets," Joe said. "It's relocating control. Whoever controls the LLC controls the operation. That's not the same as owning the land, but it's close enough to matter if someone wants to take the next step." "What's the next step?" I asked. Joe looked at me over his coffee cup. "Sale negotiation. If the LLC has authority to enter into agreements with third parties, it can negotiate a sale on behalf of the operational entity. Whether it can complete the sale depends on how the underlying property is titled." I thanked him and stood up. "Frank," Joe said before I reached the door, "tell your friend to find out how the land is titled before he signs anything. That's the only question that matters right now." I drove from Joe's office to Pete Nguyen's place on Coffee Road. Pete has been doing the farm's accounting for 20 years. He knows our books better than I do in some respects, which is how I like it. I trust him, the way you trust someone who's never given you a reason not to. I showed him page 8, just page 8, folded so he couldn't see the document title or the signature page. I handed it across his desk and watched him read it. He read it twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked at me. "Who prepared this?" he asked. "My daughter-in-law," I said. "She's a corporate attorney." Pete nodded slowly, the way people nod when something confirms what they were already thinking. He tapped the paragraph with one finger. "Frank," he said, "this operational authority language is broad enough that whoever controls CDV Holdings can negotiate contracts on behalf of the farm. That includes supply agreements, equipment leases, service contracts, and, depending on how it's structured, it could include sale negotiations." "Could they complete a sale?" I asked. "Without my signature." Pete leaned back in his chair. "That depends on the property title. If the land is in a trust with specific beneficiary protections, probably not. but they could get far enough into the process to create real problems. Signed letters of intent, earnest money agreements, representations to a buyer. He paused and looked at page 8 again. Frank, has anyone approached you recently about selling the vineyard? No, I said. He nodded. He picked up the page and held it for a moment before handing it back to me. They will, he said, probably soon. That's what this contract is for. Someone already has a buyer. This structure exists to get the deal far enough along that refusing becomes complicated. I took the page and folded it back the way it had been. Pete, I said, I need you to pull the last 2 years of farm financials. Everything. And I need you to look for anything that moved without my sign-off. He was already reaching for his keyboard. I'll have it by tomorrow morning, he said. I drove back out to the valley with the window down, the cold air coming in off the fields, thinking about what Joe had said. Whoever controls the LLC controls the operation. And what Pete had said, someone already has a buyer. Vincent's signature in blue ink. Already there before he walked through my door. I got back to the farm at noon and spent the afternoon doing what I do when I need to keep my hands busy while my head works. I serviced the irrigation pump on the east field, checked the cover crop on the south block, walked the perimeter fence on the property line that borders Sal Benedetti's place next door. Vincent and Claire were in the house. I could see lights on in the guest room and hear Claire's voice occasionally through the window, the particular cadence of someone on a work call. Vincent came out once and offered to help with whatever I was doing. I gave him the fence work on the north side because it would take him 2 hours and keep him out of my way. Rosa brought sandwiches out at 2 o'clock without being asked. She looked at me when she set them down. I shook my head slightly. Not yet, that meant. She went back inside. Anthony didn't show up for his usual end-of-day check-in at 4. He manages the day-to-day crew operations, always comes by the equipment barn before he goes home to Maria. That afternoon, he didn't come. I noticed. The way you notice when a routine breaks. He came at 9 that night instead. I was in the equipment barn doing inventory that didn't need doing, which is what I do when I'm not ready to go inside and be in the same house as something I haven't figured out yet. I heard his truck on the gravel, saw the headlights sweep across the barn wall, and then heard the door close and his boots on the ground. He didn't come in right away. He stood outside the barn door for a moment. I could see his shadow through the gap in the boards. Then he came in and closed the door behind him. Anthony is 42 years old. He has my father's build, wide through the shoulders, and he's been working this land since he was 19. He is not a man who fidgets. That night, he stood just inside the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the floor between us. I kept working. I let him get there on his own. Dad, he said finally, I need to tell you something. I set down the part I was holding. He looked up. There was something in his face I hadn't seen there before. The particular look of a man carrying something he's been carrying alone for too long. She came to me in August, he said. Claire, I waited. She said the farm was in trouble. Competitive pressure from the bigger operations, margins getting tighter, the usual things people say when they want you to believe a problem exists that you haven't noticed yourself. She said Vincent wanted to modernize, bring in professional management structure, and that it would be better for everyone, including me. He stopped. Looked at the floor again. She said if the restructuring went through, they'd want someone on the ground who knew the operation. A general manager, real title, real salary, double what I'm making now. I kept my face still. She said it would secure my future here, he continued. That without the restructuring, the farm might not make it another 10 years anyway, and that she just needed me to not make things complicated in the meantime. By complicated, I said, she meant don't tell me. Anthony looked up. Yes. How long ago did you agree to this? August, he said. 3 months ago. He'd been coming to work every day for 3 months, eating Sunday dinner with me and Rosa, saying nothing. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. I told myself it was for the good of the farm. I told myself you'd see it that way once it was done. "Anthony," I said, "did she ever tell you what they were planning to do with the farm after the restructuring?" He looked at me. "She said, modernize it," he said slowly. "Professional management, new equipment, expand the production capacity." I nodded. "Did she say anything about selling it?" The color left his face in a way I could see even in the barn light. "Not gradually, all at once, like water draining." "No," he said. "She never said anything about selling." He stood there looking at me, and I could see the thing he'd been telling himself for 3 months starting to come apart. The way a structure looks when you pull one load-bearing piece and everything above it shifts. "She promised you a future here," I said, "on land that she was planning to sell to someone else." Anthony didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer. She needed him to stay quiet long enough for the deal to get done. That was all she'd ever needed from him. Not loyalty, just silence. Long enough to finish what she'd started. I picked up the part I'd set down and turned it in my hands. "Go home to Maria," I said. "Don't tell Vincent you came here tonight. Come back in the morning and work the day the way you always do." He started to say something else. "Anthony," I said, "you made a mistake. Now you're going to help me fix it." He nodded once. Then he went out to his truck and drove home. I stood in the barn alone for a while after his headlights disappeared down the road. The equipment around me, the smell of oil and soil and old wood, the sounds the barn makes at night when the temperature drops. Then I turned off the light and walked back to the house. I came downstairs at 5 the next morning, and Rosa wasn't in the kitchen. That never happens. In 40 years of marriage, Rosa has always been in the kitchen before me. It's not something we discussed or arranged. It's just the way mornings work in this house. So when I came down and found the coffee unmade and the kitchen empty, I stood in the doorway for a moment, the way you stand when something familiar is missing. Then I heard her voice from upstairs. "Frank," she called. "Come up here." She was standing at the foot of our bed when I got to the doorway. She'd pulled the small wooden chair from the corner of the room and set it facing the bed. And she was standing beside it, the way you stand beside something you've placed deliberately. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She went to her side of the bed and knelt down and pulled open the bottom drawer of her nightstand. I'd never had reason to open that drawer. It was Rosa's drawer, the way the top shelf of the closet was my shelf, the way the left side of the sink was her side. After 40 years, you stop questioning the geography of a shared life. She lifted out a blue accordion folder, the kind with the elastic closure and the multiple interior pockets. It was thick. She carried it to the bed and set it between us and opened it. The first thing I saw was the deed to the property. The original, not a copy. My father's name was on it, and below his name in a different ink, the date it transferred to me. I knew we had this document. I didn't know where Rosa kept it. Behind the deed were the original trust documents. The DeLuca Family Trust, established 1995. Rosa and I had signed them at a lawyer's office in Fresno on a Tuesday afternoon, and then gone to dinner afterward at a place that's been closed for 20 years now. I hadn't held these papers since that day. Behind the trust documents were the property tax records going back 15 years, the water rights agreement with the county, the original equipment loans paid off in 2008, and every significant contract the farm had ever signed, organized by date in separate folders. Rosa had been keeping all of this here, in this drawer, in her nightstand. "How long?" I asked. She sat down on the bed across from the folder. "Since May," she said. "Since Vincent's birthday party in San Francisco, Claire asked me about the trust structure over dessert. She said she was just curious how farms like ours handled succession planning. I told her I didn't know the details offhand. I remembered that party. I'd been there. I hadn't heard that conversation. On the drive home, Rosa continued.
I thought about the way she asked it. Not like a daughter-in-law making conversation, like someone who needed a specific piece of information and had decided a birthday party was a reasonable place to get it.
So when we got home, I came upstairs and I moved everything from the safe in the office to here. She placed her hand on the blue folder. And then I made an appointment, she said. She reached into the back pocket of the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. A letter. On the letterhead of a law firm in Fresno I didn't recognize. Castellano and Associates, Estate and Trust Law. I went to see them in June, Rosa said. Alone. I told them I needed someone to review our trust documents and tell me what they actually said. Not what I thought they said. What they actually said. I looked at the letter. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, written in plain language. The attorney had summarized the DeLuca family trust in terms a non-lawyer could follow. The trust was irrevocable, established under California law, with Frank and Rosa DeLuca as grantors and both sons as beneficiaries. The property could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered without the written consent of both grantors. Both grantors, Frank and Rosa, both of us. There was a second paragraph Rosa had underlined in pencil. It noted that the trust contained an additional provision added in a 1998 amendment that required the signature of any beneficiary who had been employed by the trust property for more than 5 consecutive years. The attorney had flagged this as unusual and noted it provided an additional layer of protection. Anthony, I said. Rosa nodded. He's been here 18 years. His signature would be required for any sale. Claire may not know that provision exists. It wasn't in the original document. It was in the amendment. I read the letter again. Rosa, I said, you did all of this in June? Yes. While I was doing running the harvest, going about my days, thinking I was the one paying attention. She looked at me with the particular patience of a woman who has been married a long time and has learned that sometimes you wait for the other person to catch up. I wasn't going to tell you unless it became necessary, she said. I was hoping I'd misread her. I was hoping it was just a birthday party conversation and nothing more. She closed the accordion folder and held it in her lap. But then Vincent called about Thanksgiving, she said. And I knew it was necessary. I sat on that wooden chair in our bedroom, looking at my wife of 40 years, who had quietly driven to Fresno alone in June and hired a lawyer, and spent 5 months keeping every critical piece of paper in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, while I walked the vineyard every morning, thinking I was the one reading the situation. I didn't have anything to say that covered it, so I said good. Then we know where we stand. Rosa stood up and handed me the blue folder. Now you do, she said. Coffee's not made yet. I'll go start it. Claire knocked on the office door at 10 that morning. Not the house, the farm office, the small building between the equipment barn and the stone cellar where I keep the operational records, the season logs, the maps my father drew by hand and I've been updating ever since. It's not a place guests come to. You'd have to know it was there, or you'd have to have looked at the property carefully enough to find it. She'd looked carefully enough. I told her to come in. She sat down across from my desk, in the chair I use for conversations I don't want to have in the house. And she looked around the office, the same way she'd looked at the vineyard when she arrived. Taking inventory. I want to be straightforward with you, she said. I think we've been dancing around this long enough. I didn't say anything. I've found that silence is more useful than most responses in the opening of a difficult conversation. People fill silence with what they actually mean. Claire filled it quickly. The Valcourt Group has made a formal offer for the DeLuca Farm property and all associated assets, she said. $8 million. It's a strong number, Frank. It's above market for this region. I looked at her across the desk. Valcourt Group. I said, they're a wine conglomerate based in Napa. They've been acquiring family vineyards throughout the Central Valley for the past 2 years. They're well capitalized, and they close fast. She said it the way you describe a transaction you've already decided is going to happen. Does Vincent know you're having this conversation with me right now? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Vincent and I are completely aligned on this. I noticed she hadn't answered the question. $8 million, I said. For a property my father built from nothing and that I've run for 40 years. That's what it's worth on the current market, Claire said. Possibly more in 5 years if the region keeps developing. But there's also significant downside risk. Input costs are rising, water allocations are tightening, the labor market for harvest crews is getting more expensive every season. The window for a strong exit may not stay open. She had the talking points ready. She'd prepared for this meeting. Claire, I said. My father came to this country with $40. He planted the first vine on this property in 1974. He left it to me with a note that said, "Don't sell it." That's the full context for this conversation. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're waiting for you to finish. I understand the sentimental dimension, she said. But Frank, sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. It doesn't fund equipment replacement or cover the cost of a bad harvest year. At your age, with a strong offer on the table, a clean exit makes financial sense. You and Rosa would be comfortable for the rest of your lives. At your age, I let that sit there between us for a moment. I'm not signing anything, I said, and I'm not selling this farm. That's the end of this conversation. Claire looked at me. She didn't argue. She didn't push back or reframe or try another angle. She just looked at me for a moment with an expression that was patient in a way that had nothing to do with patience. Then she smiled. Not the smile she used at dinner. Not the warm one she deployed when she complimented Rosa's cooking or asked Anthony about the harvest. This was a different one entirely. Smaller, cooler. The smile of someone who has just watched you make a move they anticipated 3 steps ago. Frank, she said, standing up. I appreciate your candor. I hope you'll think it over. She walked out and closed the door quietly behind her. I sat at my desk and looked at the door after she left. Outside the office window, I could hear the wind moving through the rows, the particular sound the bare vines make in November. A dry rattling, like something trying to hold on. I thought about that smile. In 40 years of running this farm, I dealt with buyers, brokers, bankers, water district representatives, county assessors, and the occasional neighbor who wanted something that wasn't his. I'd learned to read the difference between a person who's disappointed and a person who isn't worried, between someone who needed a yes and someone who already had what they needed. Claire walked out of my office without arguing because she didn't need to argue. She thought she had already won. And the part that sat heaviest in my chest driving back to the house was that I didn't yet know exactly what she thought she had. I called Joe Caruso from the office before Claire reached the house. He picked up on the second ring. I told him Claire had just made a formal offer. $8 million, Valcourt Group. And she'd walked out smiling when I said no. I told him about the CDV Holdings operational authority, the signature lines, and the fact that she didn't argue when I refused. Joe was quiet for a moment. She's not worried about your refusal, he said. Which means she thinks the LLC structure gives her enough to move forward without your signature on the sale. Can it? I asked. Joe took a breath. Here's what I need you to understand, Frank. CDV Holdings has operational and financial authority over the farm's business activities. That sounds broad, but there's a hard limit. It does not have authority over the underlying real property, the land itself, The 400 acres is titled in the DeLuca Family Trust. The LLC can run the operation. It cannot sell the dirt. So she can't complete the sale. She can't complete it, Joe said, but she can get far enough along to cause serious problems. Signed letters of intent with Valcor, representations to a title company, earnest money in escrow. All of that creates legal entanglements that are expensive and time-consuming to unwind, even if the underlying transaction is invalid. I told him about the trust documents Rosa had, the irrevocable structure, the 1995 establishment, the 1998 amendment with Anthony's provision. Joe went quiet again. Longer this time.
Frank, he said, the amendment.
You're sure it's in there?
Rosa has the original.
I said. Castellano and Associates in Fresno reviewed it in June. They flagged the amendment specifically. He made a sound that might have been relief. That amendment is significant. If Anthony's signature is required for any property disposition, and Claire doesn't know that provision exists, she's been building a plan on a foundation that's missing a wall. She may have the LLC structure, she may have Valcourt ready to close, but she cannot complete a legally valid sale without Anthony's consent. Then we're protected. I said, "You're protected from the sale completing," Joe said. "But Frank, listen to me. There's another way this goes. If she realizes the trust is blocking her, she may try to challenge the trust itself, find a procedural defect in how it was established or amended, get a court to question its validity." I looked at the map on the wall. The property lines in my father's handwriting. "Can she do that?" I asked. "It would be a long shot," Joe said. "The trust has been in place for nearly 30 years, but a challenge would take time and money to defend, and during the challenge period, things get complicated." "Frank, do you have any reason to think she's already looking at the trust structure for weaknesses?" I thought about Claire's smile when she left my office. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I think I need to find out." After I hung up, I sat at the desk for a few minutes, turning what Joe had said over in my mind. The trust was solid. Rosa had made sure of that in June. Anthony's provision added another layer Claire likely didn't know existed. On paper, we were protected. But Claire had walked out of my office without arguing, without pushing back, without any of the negotiating moves you'd expect from someone who'd just been told no on an $8 million deal. People don't smile like that when they've lost. They smile like that when they're already playing the next move. I picked up the phone again and called Pete Nguyen. "Pete," I said when he answered, "the financials I asked you to pull. Have you found anything unusual?" "Still going through them," he said. "But Frank, there's one thing already. 3 payments in the last 18 months to a firm called Western Land Consultants, each one about $4,000. I don't have a corresponding entry in the expense ledger for what the service was." "Who authorized the payments?" I asked. "They went through the farm's operating account." Pete said, "Joint Signature Authority. The second signature on each one is Vincent's." I looked out the office window at the vineyard. "Keep going." I said, "Find everything." After I hung up, I stayed at the desk long enough to write down 2 things on a notepad. Western Land Consultants. And below it, the phrase Joe had used, the one that had settled into my chest like something cold. Prove the trust is invalid. That's what she'd do next. Not argue, not negotiate. Go after the foundation. I folded the notepad and put it in my shirt pocket and went back to the house. Sal Benedetti showed up at 7 the next morning with a bag of Meyer lemons from his tree and the look of a man who'd been deciding whether to come over since the night before. I knew that look. Sal is 71 years old, a former Modesto PD, 30 years on the force before his knees gave out and he retired to the property next door, where his family had been since before mine arrived. We share a fence line along the north edge of the vineyard and a habit of not bothering each other unless there's a reason. In 20 years of being neighbors, he'd come to my door uninvited, twice. Once when he saw smoke near the equipment barn, once when a water main broke on the road and he thought I should know before the county did. This was the third time. Rosa let him in and poured coffee without asking, and we sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, while the morning came up gray outside the window. Sal set the lemons on the table and wrapped his hands around the mug. "Frank," he said, "I don't know what's going on in your house right now, and I'm not asking, but I need to tell you something I heard yesterday." He'd been trimming the oleander along the fence line around 3 in the afternoon. Claire had been standing in the driveway near the north corner of the house, close to the fence, on her phone. His property runs right up to that corner. He said the wind was calm and her voice carried. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and put it on the table. "I wrote it down last night," he said, "while I could still remember it exact." I unfolded it. Sal's handwriting was careful and even, the handwriting of a man who spent 30 years writing police reports. The notes read closing by January. "The old man hasn't signed, but we have the LLC structure in place. Valcourt is ready when we are." Then a pause in the notes, marked with a dash. And then, "If we can establish procedural defects in the original trust, the whole thing unravels. My contact at the title company is already pulling the formation documents." I read it twice. Rosa leaned over and read it without touching the paper. "My contact at the title company," I said. Sal nodded. She said it like it was someone she'd already spoken to, not someone she was planning to call. I looked at Rosa. She was looking at the paper with an expression I recognized. The same expression she'd had when she came back from Fresno in June. Not surprise. Confirmation. "Sal," I said, "would you be willing to put a formal statement together, what you heard, when you heard it, where you were standing?" He picked up his coffee. "Frank," he said, "your father gave my father a personal loan in 1971 when the bank wouldn't touch an Italian immigrant with a property in this county. My father paid it back over 4 years, and your father never once mentioned it to anyone. I know, because my father told me on his deathbed and made me promise to remember it." He set the mug down. "Yes," he said, "I'll put it in writing, whatever you need." After Sal left, Rosa cleared the coffee cups and stood at the sink with her back to me for a moment. "She's already talking to someone at the title company," Rosa said. "That means she's not waiting for you to change your mind. She's building a parallel case while she's still in this house." I knew that. Rosa turned around. "How much time do we have before she files something?" I thought about the notes. Closing by January. It was the first week of November. 6 weeks, I said. Maybe 8. Rosa looked at me. "Then we need to move faster than she does," she said. "Not react. Move." She went back to the sink, and I sat at the table with Sal's notes in front of me. "My contact at the title company is already pulling the formation documents. Someone was looking at the 1995 trust filing right now. Today. Searching for a crack in the foundation." I thought about what Joe had said. A challenge would take time and money to defend, and during the challenge period, things get complicated. The trust was solid. But solid and untested are 2 different things, and Claire had apparently found someone willing to test it. I picked up my phone and called Joe Caruso. "Joe," I said when he answered, "I need you to pull the original trust formation records from 1995. Everything. The filing, the notarization, the attorney certifications. And I need you to look at it the way someone would look at it if they were trying to find a reason it shouldn't be valid." He was quiet for a second. "You think she's going to challenge the trust?" he said. "I think she's already started." I said, "I'll have someone on it today," Joe said. I hung up and looked out the kitchen window at the vineyard. The rows were bare and gray in the morning light, the wire lines running straight to the edge of the property where Sal's fence began. Everything my father built was in those documents. 30 years of legal standing. Rosa had protected them in a drawer. Joe was going to protect them in a courthouse. And somewhere in Modesto or Napa or wherever Claire's title company contact was sitting, someone was looking for a way to make them disappear.
We needed to move faster.
I'd met Marco Vitelli through a water rights dispute in 2015. He was consulting for the California Department of Food and Agriculture at the time, reviewing irrigation allocation appeals in the Central Valley. And he knew more about agricultural land transactions in this region than anyone I'd encountered before or since. We'd worked together on a water rights case for about 6 months, had dinner a few times, and then the case resolved, and we went back to our separate lives, the way people do when the work that connected them is finished.
I hadn't called him in 8 years. I found his number in an old contact list on my laptop,
The kind of list you keep meaning to update and never do. I called from the farm office after Rosa had gone to her gardening club and Vincent and Claire had taken the rental car somewhere without saying where.
Marco answered on the third ring.
"Frank DeLuca," he said. "It's been a while." "It has." I said, "I need to ask you something about a company called the Valcourt Group." The line went quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone who already knows what you're going to say and is deciding how much to tell you.
"What about them?" he said.
"They've made an offer on my property." I said, $8 million. My daughter-in-law is brokering it. I want to know who I'm dealing with.
Marco took a breath.
"Frank," he said, "Valcourt Group has been on our radar at CDFA for about 14 months. We've been coordinating with the FBI field office in Sacramento on a broader investigation into a pattern of vineyard acquisitions in Sonoma and Napa counties. The purchases followed a specific profile: established family operations, clean title history, strong regional reputation. They paid above market, closed fast. Then, within 18 months of acquisition, the properties showed unusual financial activity, large transfers, shell company involvement, transactions that didn't match the operational profile of a working vineyard." I sat very still.
"Money laundering,"
I said. "That's the working theory," Marco said. "Using the vineyard acquisitions as legitimate-looking vehicles to move funds through. A working farm with 40 years of clean financial history and a strong regional brand is exactly the kind of asset you'd want if you were trying to make dirty money look like agricultural revenue."
"My farm," I said.
"Your farm would be an ideal candidate," Marco said. "Clean title in a family trust, 4 decades of documented operations, established distribution relationships, no debt. From a money laundering perspective, it's almost perfect." I thought about Claire's smile when she left my office, about the way she hadn't argued. "Does your FBI contact know about the approach to my property?" I asked. "Not yet," Marco said. "But Frank, they need to. This is exactly the kind of active approach they've been looking for to advance the investigation. They have pattern evidence, but they need a live transaction." He paused. "I can give you a name," he said. "An agent in the Sacramento field office who's been leading the agricultural fraud investigation. She's thorough, she moves fast, and she's been waiting for exactly this kind of direct approach." He gave me the name without me asking for it. Special Agent Diana Reeves. He spelled the last name and gave me the field office number and her direct line. All without hesitation. The way someone gives you information they've had ready. I wrote it down on the back of a fuel receipt I found on the desk, the only paper I had nearby. "Marco?" I said, "Thank you." "Call Reeves today," he said. "Don't wait." After I hung up, I sat in the office for a moment, looking at the name on the receipt. Then I called Pete Wynn. "Pete," I said, "Western Land Consultants. The payments you found, can you trace what they actually do?" "Already on it." Pete said, "Frank, It's not a consulting firm. The business registration is in Nevada. Single member LLC, formed 18 months ago. No website, no listed employees, no professional licenses. It looks like a pass-through entity.
A shell company, I said.
That's what it looks like, Pete said. I'm pulling the state registration records now. I thanked him and hung up. I drove out to the far end of the south block and parked the truck at the edge of the property, where the vines ended and the open ground began. I sat there with the window down and the valley spread out ahead of me, the November light flat and gray on the fields. I thought about my father. He had planted these vines with borrowed equipment on land that everyone else had passed over, and he had done it because he believed that if you put honest work into honest ground, the ground would give you something back. He had been right. For 40 years, he had been right. The name on the receipt said, Special Agent Diana Reeves. I put the truck in gear and drove back to the house to make the call. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Rosa made the dinner she always makes the night before the holiday. Braised short ribs, polenta, roasted vegetables from the garden, a DeLuca Barbera from 2 years back that I'd been saving for a good occasion. It almost looked like one. Vincent opened the wine. Claire had dressed for dinner in a way that nobody at a farm table dresses for dinner, which told me the evening wasn't going to end the way it started. Anthony and Maria arrived at 6. Anthony, quieter than usual, but present in a way he hadn't been since the night he came to the barn. Maria brought a pie. We sat down. For 40 minutes it was fine. The food was good, the wine was good, and everyone performed the version of themselves they use when they want a meal to just be a meal. Vincent talked about a project at work. Maria asked Rosa about the garden. I ate and listened and watched. Then Claire set a folder on the table. She placed it beside her plate with the deliberate casualness of someone who had planned the moment. It was a thin folder, gray, with a single label on the front. She didn't open it. She just set it there and let it sit while she finished a bite of polenta. Then she looked up. I want to raise something while we're all together, she said. Valcour Group needs an answer by Monday. That's 4 days. I think we should discuss it as a family. The table went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when something everyone has been pretending isn't happening suddenly takes up all the space in the room. Vincent put down his fork. Anthony looked at his plate. Rosa continued eating. There's nothing to discuss. I said, I told you my answer yesterday. Frank, Claire said, $8 million is not a number you walk away from without a conversation. This affects everyone at this table. Vincent has a stake in the farm's future. Anthony does too. She looked at Anthony when she said it. Anthony kept his eyes on his plate. The farm's future, I said, is exactly what it's been for 40 years. I'm not selling it. Claire opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet, a timeline. Valcour's proposed closing schedule, dated, with a signature line at the bottom. Monday, she said. That's all I'm asking. Think about it over Thanksgiving and give me an answer Monday. I looked at the timeline on the table. Then I looked at Vincent. Vincent, I said, did you know she was going to do this tonight? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. It's a reasonable conversation to have, he said finally. Dad, the valley is changing. The economics of small family operations are getting harder every year. $8 million. Anthony pushed his chair back. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Claire. Tell them, he said. Claire's expression didn't move. Anthony, Claire said quietly. Tell them what you told me in August, Anthony said. About what Valcour is actually planning to do with this property. The table was completely still. She told me they were going to modernize the operation. Anthony said, looking at his father now, expand it. Professional management. She said I'd have a role in the new structure. She never said anything about selling it outright. She never said Valcourt was going to take the name off the gate and run it as a subsidiary.
Vincent turned to look at Claire. "Claire," he said. "It's a standard acquisition structure," Claire said. "The brand would be retained for marketing purposes." "This is our name," Anthony said. His voice was flat and even. "It's not a marketing asset. It's our name." Nobody spoke. Rosa set down her fork. She stood up without saying anything and walked to the cabinet above the refrigerator. She reached to the back and brought down the bottle of 1987 DeLuca Reserve, the one we'd been keeping for 37 years, and carried it back to the table. She set it in the center, unopened. She sat back down. "Not tonight," she said quietly. She picked up her fork. "This bottle is for a real celebration. This is not that night." She went back to eating as if nothing had happened. The rest of us sat there looking at the bottle in the center of the table, the old label slightly faded, the cork still in place. 37 years of waiting still intact. Claire closed the folder. Vincent was looking at his wife with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in 2 years. Not anger, not confusion. Something quieter than both of those. The look of a man who has just heard something he can't quite place yet, but knows he needs to think about. I picked up my glass and finished my wine. "Monday," I said to Claire. "You'll have my answer Monday." She nodded. The folder stayed closed for the rest of the meal. I heard him on the stairs at 2 in the morning. I'd been awake. I don't sleep well when something is unresolved, which Rosa will tell you means I haven't slept well for most of our marriage. I was lying in the dark listening to the vineyard, which makes a particular sound at night in November. The wire humming faintly when the temperature drops. And I heard the stairs creak in the specific sequence that means someone is trying not to be heard. Vincent had been sneaking down those stairs since he was 14. He never learned which step to skip. I gave him 20 minutes. Then I got up, put on the robe Rosa bought me 3 Christmases ago that I never wear, and went downstairs. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, still in his clothes from dinner. He hadn't heard me come down. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, reading something on the screen with the focused stillness of a man who has just found something he can't unfind. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He looked up. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like a man who'd been hoping someone would show up. I set his laptop between us without asking. The screen showed an email thread. The sender was a Richard Harmon with a Valcourt Group email address. The subject line read, "DeLuca Acquisition Commission Structure Confirmed." The email was addressed to Claire. I read it. Harmon was confirming the terms of Claire's compensation for brokering the DeLuca Farm acquisition. 2% of the final sale price, to be paid upon closing to an LLC called CW Advisory, registered in Delaware. At $8 million, that came to $160,000. I scrolled down. Below Harmon's email was one from Claire, sent 3 weeks earlier. She was providing Harmon with a summary of the property's trust structure and flagging what she called a potential procedural vulnerability in the 1995 formation documents. She had attached a memo from someone she referred to only as my contact at Western Title, who had reviewed the original filing and identified what they believed was a notarization irregularity in the trust amendment, the 1998 amendment. Anthony's provision. They'd found it. They'd found the amendment, and they were already looking for a way to invalidate it. I closed the laptop. Vincent was watching me. "How long have you been sitting here?" I asked. "Since midnight," he said. I got up and poured 2 glasses of water from the tap and set one in front of him. He didn't touch it. "She told me it was a tax strategy," he said. "She told me the farm was struggling and this was the best way to protect the family's assets.
She said you'd understand once it was done.
I sat back down. The commission, Vincent said, $160,000. She was going to make $160,000 off selling your farm. He said it like he was still working out what it meant. The LLC. I said, CW Advisory. Is that hers? He nodded. She set it up last year. She told me it was for independent consulting work. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. He was 38 years old, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week, which was probably accurate. He looked like someone who'd been telling himself a story for a long time, and had just read the last page and found out the ending was different from what he'd been promised. Did you know about the title company? I asked. The contact she mentioned in the email. No, he said. I didn't know about any of it. Not the commission, not the title company, not what she was planning to do with the amendment. He picked up the water glass and set it down without drinking. Dad, he said, what do we do? It was a real question, not rhetorical, not defensive. The first honest question he'd asked me in 2 years. Asked at 3 a.m. in the kitchen where he'd grown up, with his elbows on the same table where he'd done his homework and argued about curfews, and sat on the morning he told us he was moving to San Francisco. I thought about what I needed from him and what I needed to say. First, I said, you're going to forward those emails to my phone right now. All of them, the whole thread. He reached for the laptop. Second, I said, you're going to go upstairs and get a few hours of sleep, if you can. Tomorrow morning, I need you queer-headed. He started typing. And Vincent, I said, when those emails land on my phone, that's the last time either of us mentions them until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that? He looked up. Yes, he said. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up. The thread was there. Get some sleep, I said. He closed the laptop and stood up. He stood there for a moment, like he wanted to say something else. I said. He went upstairs. I sat alone in the kitchen with the emails on my phone and the vineyard dark outside the window. And I thought about what needed to happen next and in what order. Thanksgiving morning, I was in the farm office at 6:30, with the door closed and Marco's fuel receipt in front of me. I called the direct number he'd given me. It rang 4 times, and I was preparing for voicemail when someone picked up. Reeves, she said. Special Agent Reeves, I said. My name is Frank DeLuca. I'm a vineyard owner in the Central Valley. Marco Vitelli at CDFA gave me your number. I have information about an approach by the Valcourt Group to acquire my property. A brief pause. Then, go ahead, Mr. DeLuca. She had a flat, efficient voice, the kind that doesn't waste time on preliminaries. I gave her the relevant facts in the order they happened. The CDV Holdings LLC, the Valcourt offer, the commission structure in the email thread Vincent had found, the shell company in Delaware, the memo about the trust amendment, Sal Benedetti's statement, the Western Land Consultants' payments through the farm account. I kept it to facts and sequence, no editorializing. She let me finish without interrupting. How did you come to have access to the email thread, she asked. My son found it on his wife's laptop. I said, she's the broker on the other side of this transaction. He forwarded it to me this morning. And your son's current position on this? He's cooperative, I said. Fully. Another pause. Longer. Mr. DeLuca, she said, the Valcourt Group is currently the subject of an active federal investigation involving suspected financial fraud across multiple agricultural acquisitions in Northern California. What you're describing is consistent with the acquisition pattern we've been documenting.
A direct approach to a clean title family property is significant for our purposes.
I understand, I said. I'm going to need the email thread, the LLC registration documents if you have them, and a written statement from your neighbor. Can you get those to me today? I said. I also have a land attorney who's been reviewing the trust structure. He may have relevant documentation on the title company contacts she mentioned. Put him on, she said. I called Joe on the other line and conference called him in. Joe had been awake since 5, which told me he'd been expecting this call. He gave Reeves a summary of the trust structure, the CDV Holdings filing, and what he'd found when he pulled the original 1995 formation records. The notarization irregularity Claire's contact had flagged was real, but minor, he said. A correctable clerical error that had no bearing on the trust's validity under California law. It wasn't enough to invalidate anything, but it was enough for someone to argue about in court if they wanted to cause problems. Reeves listened to all of it. Mr. Caruso, she said when he finished, can you prepare a legal opinion on the trust's validity by end of day tomorrow? Already drafting it, Joe said. After Joe dropped off the call, Reeves came back. Mr. DeLuca, she said, I want to be direct with you. The evidence you've provided this morning, combined with what we already have on Valcor, is enough for me to expand the scope of our investigation to include this transaction specifically. That means we'll be moving on this, not in weeks, in days. I looked at the map on the wall, the one my father had drawn in pencil in 1974. The property lines, faint and precise, each block labeled in his handwriting. I'd added to it over the years in different pencils, different inks. 40 years of the same map being updated by different hands. What do you need from me between now and then? I asked. Nothing, she said. Go have Thanksgiving dinner. Don't tell your daughter-in-law anything has changed. Don't sign anything. Don't leave the property if you can avoid it. I can do that, I said. Good. I'll be in touch. She hung up. I sat in the office for a moment with the phone in my hand, looking at the map and at my father's handwriting, and at the window where the vineyard was catching the first real light of the morning, the frost on the wires turning gold as the sun came over the ridge. I had not felt this particular thing in some time. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of having put something into the hands of someone who knew what to do with it. Rosa knocked on the office door. Frank, she said through the wood. Dinner's at 2. I need you in the kitchen by noon. I put the fuel receipt in the desk drawer. I'll be right there, I said. And for the first time in 3 weeks, when I said it, I meant it without qualification. Claire came downstairs at 8:30. I heard her on the stairs, and I didn't look up from my coffee. Joe Caruso was sitting to my left with a folder of his own and a cup of Rosa's coffee that he'd been working on for 20 minutes. Pete Wynn was at the end of the table with his laptop open and a printed spreadsheet beside it. Rosa was at the counter with her back to the room, doing something with the dishes that didn't require her full attention. Claire stopped in the kitchen doorway. She took in the 3 of us at the table the way she'd taken in the vineyard the first morning she arrived. Quickly, completely, assigning value and meaning to everything she saw. Joe she recognized as a neighbor. Pete she knew as the farm accountant. The folder in the center of the table she didn't recognize, but she looked at it the way you look at something you know is about you. She came in and poured herself coffee. Frank, she said, I didn't realize you had company. Joe and Pete aren't company. I said, sit down, Claire. She sat across from me. Vincent came down the stairs behind her and stopped when he saw the room. He looked at me, and I nodded once. He came in and stood near the counter beside Rosa. I opened Rosa's blue accordion folder and put it on the table between us. The deed, I said. The original trust documents. The 1998 amendment with Anthony's provision. And a legal opinion from Joe's office,
confirming the trust is valid and unassailable under California law, including the notarization in the amendment that your title company contact flagged.
Claire looked at the documents. She didn't touch them.
Pete, I said.
He turned his laptop to face her.
On the screen was a spreadsheet showing the 3 payments to Western Land Consultants, the dates, the amounts, and below them, the Nevada LLC registration showing Western Land Consultants as a single-member entity with no employees and no operational history.
A pass-through, Pete said.
3 payments totaling $11,800 moved through your farm's operating account to a shell company with no business purpose we can identify.
Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. And then there's the email thread.
I said, I set my phone on the table with the Harmon thread on the screen. The commission structure. CW Advisory LLC in Delaware. $160,000 payable to Claire upon closing.
She looked at the phone.
Then she looked at me.
Frank, she said,
these are business arrangements, consulting fees, commission structures. These are standard in complex transactions.
Claire?
I said, I spoke with Special Agent Diana Reeves at the FBI Sacramento field office yesterday morning. Agent Reeves sends her regards.
The room was quiet. Claire set her coffee mug down carefully.
The Valcourt Group, I said, is under active federal investigation for financial fraud. Their acquisition pattern in Sonoma and Napa counties has been documented for 14 months. This property was the next step in that pattern. The emails you sent to Richard Harmon establish your knowledge of the transaction structure and your financial interest in its completion.
That's not she started. Joe.
I said.
Joe opened his own folder and slid a single page across the table.
It was a summary of the relevant federal statutes. He'd highlighted 2 sections.
Claire looked at the page without picking it up.
The CDB Holdings filing, Joe said, combined with the commission arrangement and the approach to a property whose owners had explicitly refused, creates a pattern that Agent Reeves's office considers consistent with their ongoing investigation. I've spoken with her office this morning. They're aware of everything on this table.
Vincent, Claire said.
She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, looking at the floor between them. He didn't look up.
Vincent, she said again.
Tell him this is a misunderstanding, she said. Tell him we can work this out as a family.
Vincent raised his head.
He looked at his wife across the kitchen.
Claire, he said.
I found the emails myself. I forwarded them to my father. There's nothing to work out. It was the most words he'd said directly to her since the night before. And he said them in the same quiet voice he uses when something is settled. I recognized it. He'd had it since he was a boy. When Vincent stopped arguing, it meant he was done.
Claire looked at him for a moment.
Then she looked back at me. Her face had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness she'd been wearing for a week. Something underneath that. The stillness of someone recalculating in real time, with fewer options than they'd expected.
She stood up.
I'll need to speak with my attorney, she said.
That's your right, Joe said.
She walked out of the kitchen. We heard her on the stairs. Then the guest room door. Then nothing.
I picked up my coffee.
Rosa turned around from the counter and looked at the table.
Pete, she said.
Do you want more coffee?
Pete closed his laptop.
Yes, please, he said.
Rosa poured.
The morning light was coming through the kitchen window the way it always does at this hour, falling across the table in a wide stripe that moved slowly toward the wall as the sun came up.
I looked at Vincent.
He was still standing by the counter. He looked like a man who'd put something down after carrying it a long way. Not happy, not relieved, just lighter than he'd been an hour ago.
She's not finished, I said quietly.
I know, Vincent said.
He did know. That was something. Claire checked out of the guest room at noon. She packed efficiently, which I would have expected. She came downstairs with one bag and her laptop case and said she needed to get back to the city for a client matter. She said it to the room in general, not to anyone specifically. Vincent was in the living room. He didn't get up. She went out to the rental car and drove down the gravel road without looking back at the vineyard. I watched from the porch. Vincent came and stood beside me. We watched the car until it disappeared, where the road curved behind the eucalyptus brake. "She'll file something," I said. "I know," Vincent said. He went back inside. Joe called at 4 that afternoon. "Frank," he said, "Donna at the courthouse clerk's office just called me. A petition was filed this morning by an attorney named Garvey out of a San Francisco firm. It's a request for judicial review of the DeLuca Family Trust on grounds of procedural defect in formation." Claire had filed from the road. She'd called her attorney before she reached the freeway. "What does it say?" I asked. Joe read me the relevant section. The petition alleged that the 1995 trust formation contained a notarization irregularity that rendered the document legally deficient, and that the 1998 amendment was therefore invalid as it relied on a defective foundational document. It requested that the court appoint a neutral trustee to administer the property pending review. "A neutral trustee," I said. "Someone she could work with," Joe said. "While a neutral trustee is in place, the existing trustees lose operational authority. It's a way to get around your refusal without getting a signature." "How long does that take?" I asked. "The petition itself," Joe said, "is the weakest thing I've read in 30 years of land law. The notarization issue is correctable and, frankly, irrelevant to the trust's validity. Any competent judge is going to see that, but the process to get it in front of a judge takes time and money to defend. And during that window, things get complicated for the property." He paused. "But Frank, here's the thing. I called Reeves before I called you. And the petition has been flagged by the court administrator as related to an active federal investigation. The presiding judge has been notified. Processing is on hold pending coordination with the FBI. Claire just handed us a dated, signed, filed legal document that establishes her intent to circumvent the trust structure she knew was blocking the transaction." I sat down on the porch steps. "Motive." I said, "Premeditation," Joe said. "And a paper trail with her attorney's name on it. Frank, this was the worst thing she could have done." Pete Nguyen called 20 minutes later. "Frank," he said, "I found something in the CDV Holdings bank records. There were 2 wire transfers from CDV Holdings to a Valcourt Group subsidiary account. Both happened in September, before the formal offer was ever made to you, before she brought the restructuring proposal to the house." "So the deal was already structured before she arrived?" I said. "The money was already moving," Pete said. "The offer wasn't an offer. It was a closing step." I called Joe back and told him what Pete had found. He was quiet for a moment. And then he made a sound I hadn't heard from him in all the years I'd known him. Something between a laugh and an exhale. "Frank," he said, "call Reeves right now. Before I hang up, call her." I clicked over and called Reeves's direct line. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. "Pete Nguyen found wire transfers," I said. "CDV Holdings to a Valcourt subsidiary, September, before the formal offer. And Joe Caruso has a petition filed this morning by Claire's attorney challenging the trust." "I know about the petition," she said. "We flagged it an hour ago. The wire transfers are new. Send me Pete's documentation in the next 30 minutes. I'll have it to you in 15. I said, "Mr. DeLuca," Reeves said, "I want you to stay close to your phone this evening." After I hung up, I sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon light, the valley going gray as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. I thought about Claire driving north on 99 right now, probably on the phone with Garvey, probably believing the petition would buy her enough time. Joe called back at 7:30. They've issued a warrant, he said. And Frank, they found the shell company, CW Advisory in Delaware, the commission account. I know about CW Advisory, I said. There's a second name on the registration, Joe said. I waited. That's what I was afraid to tell you, he said. I drove to Joe's office without calling ahead. It was dark by the time I got to McHenry Avenue. The streetlights on, and the hardware store below Joe's office closed for the evening. His light was still on upstairs. I parked and went up and knocked, and he opened the door before I finished knocking, which meant he'd been watching for my truck. Agent Reeves was sitting in the chair across from Joe's desk. She was younger than I'd expected from her voice. Mid-40s, maybe, in a dark jacket with a badge clipped to her belt and a legal pad on her knee with notes already on it. She stood when I came in and shook my hand with the directness of someone who doesn't use the gesture for anything other than its practical purpose. Mr. DeLuca, she said. Sit down. I sat. CW Advisory, LLC, she said, was registered in Delaware 14 months ago. 2 members, Claire Ann Whitmore DeLuca, and a second individual using a business address in Sacramento. She turned the Weagle pad so I could read it. The name was Richard Harmon. I'd expected that. Harmon was Valcor's broker, the one who'd sent the commission confirmation email. His name on the shell company connected him directly to Claire's side of the transaction, which was the link Reeves needed to tie both ends of the deal together. But Reeves hadn't finished. Richard Harmon, she said, spent 11 years at the California Department of Food and Agriculture before going into private consulting 4 years ago. During his time at CDFA, he worked primarily in the Central Valley Agricultural Division, coordinating land use reviews and acquisition oversight. I looked at her. He worked under Marco Vitelli, she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Harmon and Vitelli overlapped at CDFA for 6 years, Reeves continued. They've maintained a professional relationship since Harmon left. Based on our investigation, we believe Vitelli was aware of the Valcourt acquisition strategy and Harmon's involvement in it. When you called Vitelli about Valcourt, he already knew about the approach to your property. He gave you my name and number because he believed that initiating contact with our office would create the appearance of cooperation and potentially slow or redirect our investigation away from the Central Valley acquisitions. I sat with that for a moment. He sent me to you on purpose, I said. To create a record of voluntary cooperation, Reeves said. What he didn't anticipate was the quality of evidence you'd already assembled. The email thread, the wire transfers, Pete Wynn's financial analysis, Sal Benedetti's statement. You gave us more than he expected you to have. Joe was watching me from behind his desk. I thought about the phone call with Marco. 8 years of silence and then a conversation where he'd given me Reeves's direct line without hesitation, spelled the name, provided the field office number and the direct extension, all before I'd asked for any of it. I'd taken it as the generosity of an old contact doing a favor. I'd read it exactly wrong. In 40 years of dealing with people across a table, I had misread exactly one of them completely. How much does this change? I asked Reeves. It adds a conspiracy charge, she said. Harmon, Vitelli, and Claire are now connected in a coordinated effort to defraud the property owners of a trust-protected asset. That's a federal matter. Wire transfers across state lines to a Delaware LLC make it federal regardless. Vitelli's attempt to use our office as cover makes it worse for him, not better. She closed her legal pad. We'll be making arrests in the next 48 hours, she said. I wanted you to hear about Vitelli directly, given that he was your contact. I nodded. Is there anything else you need from me? I asked. No, she said. You've given us everything we needed. Go home, Mr. DeLuca. I shook her hand again and went downstairs. I sat in the truck for a few minutes before starting it. The street was empty. The hardware store window reflected my headlights back at me
when I turned the ignition.
Marco Vitelli.
30 years of professional acquaintance. Dinner at my table twice, maybe 3 times over the years. His handshake at a water rights hearing in 2015 when we first met. Firm and direct. The handshake of a man presenting himself as trustworthy. My father used to say the land never betrays you, Frank. Only people do. He said it about frost, about drought, about the way a vine would still try to fruit even in a bad year if the roots were deep enough. He meant it as comfort, the idea that nature was at least honest in its hardships. I'd never thought to apply it to a man I'd known for 30 years. I drove home in the dark with the heater running and the valley black on both sides of the road. The vineyard rows invisible but present, the way they always are, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Monday morning, I was in the Northwest Block at 7 when the phone rang. The Northwest Block is the oldest part of the property, the section my father planted first. I go there when I need to think, or when I don't need to think and just need to be somewhere that makes sense. I was checking the cover crop between the rows, the winter rye coming in green and low against the brown soil, when Reeves called. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. Claire Ann Whitmore DeLuca was arrested this morning at her San Francisco residence at 6:15. Richard Harmon was taken into custody at his Sacramento office at 6:40. Marco Vitelli was arrested at his home in Davis at 7:05. 2 Valcourt Group executives were arrested simultaneously at the company's Napa office. I stood in the row and looked down the length of the block, the wire lines running straight to the far end of the property. CDV Holdings LLC has been administratively dissolved by order of the California Secretary of State, pending the federal proceedings. Reeves continued. The petition filed against the DeLuca Family Trust has been withdrawn by the court following notification of the federal charges. Your property title is clear. Mr. DeLuca, no encumbrances, no pending actions. I understood, I said. The charges include wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and, in Vitelli's case, obstruction of a federal investigation. I'll send you the formal notification by end of day. Thank you, Agent Reeves. Thank your neighbor, she said. His written statement was the clearest piece of independent evidence in the file. And your wife's attorney in Fresno? That trust opinion was airtight. She hung up. I stood in the Northwest Block for a few minutes after the call. The cover crop around my boots. The morning cold and clear. 40 years this ground had been in my family. 40 years of harvests and droughts, and one bad frost in '93 that cost us 1/3 of the crop and nearly broke us. My father's handwriting on the property map in the office. Rose's accordion folder in the nightstand drawer. It was still here. All of it. I walked back to the house. Vincent's car was in the driveway at noon. Not the rental, his own car, the one he'd driven down from San Francisco, which meant he'd made the decision before he left the city that morning. He was sitting on the porch steps when I came around the corner of the house, elbows on his knees, looking at the gravel between his feet. He looked up when he heard me. I didn't call ahead, he said. I can see that, I said. I wasn't sure you'd want me to come. I looked at my son, sitting on the steps of the house where he grew up. He had driven 3 hours to sit on those steps and wasn't sure he'd be welcome. That was information. I sat down beside him. We were quiet for a moment. Down the slope, the vineyard rows were gray-brown in the November light, the cover crop the only green thing visible. She called me from the car, Vincent said. After she left Friday, she said the petition would resolve everything. She said I needed to trust her process. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her I'd already forwarded the emails to you. He said it without drama, the way you state a fact that doesn't require decoration. How did she respond? I asked. She hung up.
he said. He picked up a piece of gravel from the step and turned it in his fingers. I've been trying to figure out, he said slowly, how much I knew and was ignoring versus how much I genuinely didn't see. I don't have a clean answer. I don't need a clean answer. I said, I need you to come inside. He looked at me. Rosa's making lunch. I said, you're staying. He put the gravel down. We went inside. Rosa looked up from the stove when we came through the door, took in Vincent standing behind me, and turned back to what she was cooking without saying anything. She got a third plate from the cabinet and set it on the table. Anthony arrived at 12:30 with Maria, which meant Rosa had called him after I came in from the vineyard. We sat down, the five of us, at the old table that Claire had once called outdated and Rosa had refused to replace because her mother had given it to them 30 years ago. Rosa brought the food. Vincent poured water for everyone. Anthony passed the bread without being asked. It was ordinary. That was the thing about it. After everything, it was just lunch at a kitchen table in November, the way it had been for 40 years before any of this started. After the plates were cleared, Rosa went to the cabinet above the refrigerator. She brought the 1987 DeWuka Reserve to the table and set it in the center the way she had on Thanksgiving Eve. Still unopened, she sat down and looked at it for a moment. Not yet, she said, but we're getting there. Vincent looked at the bottle, then at me. Is that the 87? It is, I said. He nodded slowly. What are you waiting for? Rosa answered before I could. The right celebration, she said. We'll know it when it comes. Vincent looked at the bottle a moment longer. Then he picked up his water glass. To getting there, he said. We raised our glasses. Water, not wine. The 87 stayed in the center of the table, waiting, the way it had been waiting for 37 years. Patient, like the vines in winter, like everything on this property that had learned to wait for the right time. Spring came the way it always does in the Central Valley, without announcement. One morning, the cover crop is brown and dormant, and the vines are bare sticks against the wire. And then a week later, something has shifted in the ground temperature, and the first buds are pushing out from the canes, small and green and certain. You don't watch it happen. You just notice one morning that it already has. I was in the northwest block at sunrise when I knelt down and pressed my palm flat against the soil, the way my father taught me. The ground was warming, not warm yet, but no longer cold in the way that means nothing is moving. Something was moving. You could feel it if you knew what to listen for. The vines would fruit again this year. They always did. Claire accepted a plea agreement in February. 4 years probation, $120,000 in restitution, and surrender of her California bar license. Richard Harmon received 18 months federal custody. Marco Vitelli, whose cooperation attempt had failed to mitigate anything, received 26 months. The two Val Court executives were still in proceedings as of March, the kind of federal case that moves at its own pace, regardless of what anyone would prefer. Joe Caruso called me when the plea was finalized. It's done, Frank, he said. I know, I said. Thank you, Joe. He paused. Your father would have handled this exactly the same way, he said. Probably faster. I told him I doubted that, and we said goodbye, and I went back to what I was doing. Vincent drove down the first weekend of March and spent 2 days walking the property with Anthony. Not discussing anything in particular, as far as I could tell, just walking. Anthony showed him the Eastfield drainage project we were putting in, the new equipment we'd ordered, the cover crop rotation we were trying in the South Block. Vincent asked questions and listened to the answers,
and didn't offer opinions he hadn't been asked for.
On Sunday afternoon, I found them sitting on the tailgate of Anthony's truck at the edge of the Northwest Block,
Passing a thermos of coffee between them. I walked over. Nobody said anything for a few minutes. The three of us sat there looking at the vines.
Vincent said, "Anthony, did you always know you were going to stay?" Anthony thought about it. "I left once," Anthony said. "You remember.
Freshman year at Fresno State. I lasted 4 months.
I remember."
Vincent said,
"I came back because I thought Dad needed the help."
Anthony said, "That's what I told myself. Then about a year in, I figured out that wasn't why I came back."
"Why did you?" Vincent asked. Anthony picked up a piece of soil from the truck bed,
Turned it in his fingers. Put it back.
"Because this is the only place I've ever understood anything,"
He said.
Vincent nodded.
He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to.
That evening, Rosa made dinner, and the four of us ate at the old table,
With the kitchen window open to the March air coming off the vineyard. After dinner, Anthony and Maria drove home, and Vincent helped Rosa with the dishes, which he hadn't done since he was 17, and we'd made it a rule.
I went to the cabinet above the refrigerator.
The 1987 DeLuca Reserve was where it had always been, in the back, behind the everyday glasses. I took it down and carried it to the table and set it in front of Rosa.
She looked at it.
Then at me.
"Now," she said.
"I think so," I said. She looked at it a moment longer. Then she nodded. Vincent came out of the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel. He saw the bottle on the table and stopped.
"Is that?"
"Yes," I said. "Get 3 glasses." He got 3 glasses from the cabinet, the good ones Rosa keeps for occasions, and set them on the table. I cut the foil and drew the cork, which came out clean after 37 years, which is either good winemaking or luck, or both.
I poured 3 glasses.
The wine was darker than I expected, deeper, with the color that only comes from decades of patience in a bottle. We held the glasses without drinking for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the vineyard was dark and the first stars were showing. Rosa said your father planted those vines in October of 1974. He pressed the first fruit by hand in a borrowed tub in this driveway. He made 11 cases that first year and gave most of them away because he said a man who grows something the first time should share it. She looked at her glass. He kept 1 bottle, she said. Drank it alone the night he finished paying off the land. He said it tasted like something he couldn't name, but recognized. She raised her glass. I think I know what he meant, she said. We drank. It tasted the way things taste when they've been kept for the right reason and opened at the right time. Not perfect, better than perfect. Honest. I want to tell you something before I finish. This story isn't about a vineyard, or a contract, or a family that almost lost what it had taken 40 years to build. It's about what happens when you treat something temporary like it's permanent, and something permanent like it's temporary. Claire treated this land like a transaction and treated trust like an obstacle. She was wrong about both. The land is still here. The trust held. The family is still here, which is harder to say, but true. If someone in your life is treating what you've built like something to be managed or monetized or maneuvered around, pay attention. Not to the anger of it, to the information of it. People tell you who they are if you watch carefully enough and long enough. My father knew that. Rosa knew it before I did. Even the soil knew it. That October morning when I pressed my palm against the ground and felt something wrong before I could name it. I don't know what you're protecting. Maybe it's land. Maybe it's something else entirely. A business, a family, a version of yourself you've worked 40 years to become. Whatever it is, the principle is the same. Know what you have. Know what it's worth. And don't let anyone tell you the two are the same thing. If this story meant something to you, I'd be glad to hear it in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, pass it along. That's what stories are for. The 1987 DeLuca Reserve is gone now. We finished the bottle that night, the three of us, at the kitchen table, with the vineyard dark outside the window and the first stars of spring showing over the ridge. It was the right night. We knew it when it came.